What if I told you that everything you've been taught about when the Gospels were written is based on a lie? What if the very foundation of modern biblical scholarship rests on assumptions so flawed, so deliberately misleading, that they've obscured one of the most important truths about Christianity for over a century? You see, there's a secret that biblical scholars don't want you to discover. A secret so powerful that it could completely revolutionize how we understand the reliability of the New Testament. And this secret has been hidden in plain sight for decades, buried beneath layers of academic jargon and scholarly consensus that serves a very specific agenda. Today we're going to expose this conspiracy of silence. We're going to reveal why modern scholars insist the Gospels were written so late, decades after Jesus died. We're going to uncover the real reason they refuse to acknowledge the overwhelming evidence that points to much earlier dates. And by the end of this investigation, you'll understand why this matters more than you ever imagined. But first, let me ask you something. Where are you watching this from right now? Are you in the United States, perhaps sitting in your living room questioning what you've been taught? Maybe you're in the United Kingdom, or somewhere in Africa, Asia, or South America. I want to know because this message needs to reach truth seekers everywhere. Drop a comment and tell me your location. Let's build a global community of people who refuse to accept lies disguised as scholarship. And if you're serious about discovering the truth that's been hidden from you, hit that subscribe button right now. Don't just watch and leave. Become part of this movement. We're building something powerful here, a place where we expose the deceptions that have infiltrated biblical studies and reveal the evidence they don't want you to see. Here's what most Christians don't realize. The dating of the Gospels isn't just an academic exercise, it's spiritual warfare. Because if the Gospels were written as late as modern scholars claim, it calls into question everything about their reliability. It suggests that the accounts of Jesus were written by people who never knew him, based on legends that had decades to develop and change. It implies that what we read in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John might be more myth than history. But what if that entire narrative is wrong? What if it's been deliberately constructed to undermine your faith in the Word of God? Let me paint you a picture of what really happened. On a scorching day in 70 AD, the Roman legions under General Vespasian and his son Titus finally breached the walls of Jerusalem. What followed was carnage beyond imagination. Over 1 million Jews were slaughtered. The magnificent temple, the crown jewel of Judaism, was burned to the ground. The city that Jesus had wept over was left in ruins, exactly as he had predicted. This event, the destruction of Jerusalem, has become the linchpin of modern gospel dating. Here's how the deception works. Modern scholars look at Jesus' prophecies about Jerusalem's destruction in the Gospels and make a shocking assumption. They assume that accurate prophecy is impossible. They assume that Jesus couldn't have actually predicted the future. Therefore, they conclude, these prophecies must have been written after the destruction occurred, as historical hindsight dressed up as divine foresight. This assumption has a fancy Latin name, vaticinium ex eventu, which means prophecy after the event. It sounds scholarly and sophisticated, but it's built on a foundation of pure skepticism. It's the academic way of saying, we don't believe God can reveal the future, so any accurate prediction must be a fraud. Based on this assumption, they've constructed an entire timeline that places all 4 Gospels after 70 AD. Mark, they claim, was written around 70 AD, just as Jerusalem was falling. Matthew and Luke came later, perhaps 80 to 85 AD. And John, the latest of all, wasn't completed until 90 to 95 AD. This timeline has become gospel truth in universities around the world, pardon the pun. But here's where it gets interesting. What if I told you that this entire dating scheme falls apart when you examine the evidence objectively? What if the very silence of the Gospels about Jerusalem's destruction proves they were written before it happened, not after? Think about this logically. Jesus made one of the most specific and dramatic prophecies in all of Scripture. He looked at the temple, that magnificent structure that had taken decades to build, and declared that not one stone would be left upon another. He predicted that Jerusalem would be surrounded by armies, that the inhabitants would be slaughtered, that the city would be trampled by Gentiles. Now, if you were writing a gospel account decades after this prophecy had been spectacularly fulfilled, wouldn't you mention it? Wouldn't you point out that Jesus' words had come true exactly as he predicted? Wouldn't this be the ultimate proof of his divine authority? Yet none of the gospel writers do this. None of them say, and just as Jesus predicted, Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD. They record the prophecy, but they never mention its fulfillment. This silence is deafening, and it points to only one logical conclusion. The Gospels were written before the destruction occurred, when it was still a prophecy, not a historical fact. But the evidence for early dating goes far beyond this argument from silence. Let's examine the book of Acts, which was written by Luke as a sequel to his Gospel. Acts tells the story of the early church, following the apostles as they spread the gospel throughout the Roman Empire. The narrative builds to a climax with Paul's arrival in Rome, where he's placed under house arrest, and then, abruptly, the story ends. Paul is still alive, still preaching under guard in Rome. The book concludes around 62 AD with Paul's situation unresolved. This ending has puzzled scholars for centuries, but the explanation is actually quite simple. Luke finished writing Acts before Paul's fate was determined, which means Acts was completed by 62 or 63 AD. Now, here's where this gets crucial. If Acts was finished by 63 AD, and Acts is the sequel to Luke's Gospel, then Luke's Gospel must have been completed even earlier. And if Luke used Mark as a source, as most scholars believe, then Mark must have been written earlier still. This pushes the composition of the Gospels back into the 50s and early 60s AD, a full decade or more before Jerusalem's destruction. But wait, there's more. Acts doesn't just end abruptly with Paul under house arrest. It also fails to mention several major events that would have been impossible to ignore if Luke was writing after they occurred. There's no mention of Paul's death, which happened in the mid-60s under Nero's persecution. There's no mention of Peter's martyrdom, also during Nero's reign. There's no mention of the Jewish war that began in 66 AD and culminated in Jerusalem's destruction. There's no mention of Nero's systematic persecution of Christians, which began after the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD. This silence isn't accidental. It's evidence. Luke wasn't writing with the benefit of hindsight about these events because they hadn't happened yet when he completed his work. The implications of this are staggering. If the Gospels were written in the 50s and early 60s AD, they were composed within 20 to 30 years of Jesus' death and resurrection. Many of the eyewitnesses would still have been alive. The apostles were still actively ministering. The events described in the Gospels would have been within living memory of thousands of people who could have corrected any inaccuracies. But modern scholarship has buried this evidence under layers of theoretical complexity. They've created elaborate hypotheses about sources and redactions, about communities and traditions, about theological development and literary dependence. They've made gospel studies so complicated that only experts can navigate the maze of academic jargon. Meanwhile, they've ignored the most obvious explanation for the evidence. The Gospels were written early because they were written by people who were there, who saw what happened, who heard what Jesus said. They weren't products of decades of legendary development. They were eyewitness accounts recorded while the memories were still fresh. This brings us to another crucial piece of evidence that scholars try to downplay. From the very beginning of Christian history, the Gospels were attributed to specific authors: Matthew the tax collector, Mark the companion of Peter, Luke the physician and companion of Paul, and John the beloved disciple. These weren't anonymous documents that somehow acquired names over time. They were authored works from the start. Here's a fact that will shock you. There are no anonymous copies of the Gospels. Zero. Every single manuscript we possess, from the earliest fragments to the latest medieval copies, attributes the Gospels to their traditional authors. The names Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John appear consistently across all manuscript traditions, in all languages, in all geographical locations. If the Gospels were really anonymous for decades before receiving their traditional attributions, how do we explain this universal consistency? How did scribes in Africa and scribes in Italy, working independently in the 2nd century, both know to attribute the same gospel to Matthew? How did they all agree on Luke, Mark, and John? The answer is simple. The attributions weren't added later. They were original. The Gospels were never anonymous because they were written by the people whose names they bear. But perhaps the most compelling evidence for early dating comes from the Church Fathers themselves. These were men who lived in the centuries immediately following the apostolic era. They had access to sources and traditions that we've lost. They knew people who knew the apostles. And their testimony is remarkably consistent. Papias, writing around 120 to 130 AD, explicitly states that Mark recorded Peter's preaching about Jesus, and that Matthew composed his gospel in the Hebrew language. Irenaeus, writing around 180 AD, confirms that Matthew wrote his gospel while Peter and Paul were preaching in Rome, which would place it in the early 60s at the latest. Justin Martyr, Clement of Alexandria, Tertullian, and numerous other early Christian writers all affirm the traditional authorship and early composition of the Gospels. These weren't gullible people accepting legends. They were scholars and leaders who had every reason to be careful about historical accuracy. Their unanimous testimony carries enormous weight, yet modern scholars dismiss it as unreliable tradition. Why would they do this? What's driving this systematic rejection of early dating and traditional authorship? The answer lies in the philosophical assumptions that underpin modern biblical criticism. You see, much of contemporary gospel scholarship is built on naturalistic presuppositions. It assumes that miracles don't happen, that prophecy is impossible, that supernatural claims must have natural explanations. From this starting point, the Gospels can't be reliable historical accounts of divine intervention in human history. They must be later theological reflections, community products that developed over time as early Christians tried to make sense of their experiences. This isn't neutral scholarship. It's ideology masquerading as academic objectivity. It's a worldview that has predetermined the conclusions before examining the evidence. The consequences of this ideological bias extend far beyond academic circles. When these late dates became established in universities and seminaries, they filtered down into churches across the world. Pastors who once preached with confidence about the historical reliability of the Gospels began hedging their statements. Sunday school teachers started emphasizing faith over facts. Christian apologetics shifted from defending historical truth to explaining why historical accuracy didn't really matter anyway. This intellectual retreat has had devastating effects on Christian faith. When believers are told that the Gospels were written decades after the events they describe, by people who weren't there, based on traditions that had time to evolve and change, it plants seeds of doubt. If the Gospel writers weren't eyewitnesses, how can we trust what they recorded? If decades passed before anything was written down, how much of the original truth was lost or distorted? These questions eat away at faith like acid. They transform the solid rock of scriptural authority into shifting sand, and that's exactly what the proponents of late dating want to achieve. They're not just dating documents, they're undermining the foundation of Christian belief. But here's what they don't want you to discover. The evidence for early gospel composition isn't just strong, it's overwhelming. And it comes from multiple independent lines of investigation that all point to the same conclusion. Consider the linguistic evidence. The Gospels are written in Greek, but they contain numerous Aramaisms, Hebrew expressions translated into Greek. These linguistic fingerprints suggest composition by people who were familiar with the original Aramaic and Hebrew context of Jesus' ministry. As time passed and Christianity spread into the Gentile world, these Semitic influences would have naturally diminished. The presence of so many Aramaisms in the Gospels suggests they were written while the Aramaic-speaking witnesses were still active and influential. Then there's the cultural evidence. The Gospels display intimate knowledge of Palestinian geography, customs, and social conditions as they existed before 70 AD. They know about the temple practices, the political tensions, the religious debates that characterized first-century Judaism. After the destruction of Jerusalem, much of this cultural context was lost or radically transformed. The detailed accuracy of the Gospel accounts suggests they were composed while this world was still intact. The archaeological evidence is equally compelling. Recent excavations have confirmed numerous details mentioned in the Gospels that scholars once dismissed as legendary. The Pool of Bethesda, the Pool of Siloam, the pavement where Pilate judged Jesus, all of these have been discovered and verified. The Gospel's archaeological accuracy is consistent with eyewitness composition, not late legendary development. Perhaps most significantly, we need to examine what happened to the early Christian community after 70 AD. The destruction of Jerusalem wasn't just a political catastrophe. It was a theological earthquake that forced Christianity to completely reconceptualize its relationship to Judaism, to the temple, to the Promised Land. The Jerusalem church, the mother church of Christianity, was scattered to the winds. The apostolic leadership was disrupted. The entire context in which Christianity had developed was shattered. If the Gospels were written after this catastrophe, they would necessarily reflect this new reality. They would show the influence of post-70 AD theological development. They would address the crisis of faith that the destruction created. They would explain how Christianity survived the end of the Temple era. But they don't do any of this. The Gospels present Jesus as operating within the intact world of first-century Judaism. They record his interactions with the temple, his debates with the Pharisees, his movement through a landscape that was about to be destroyed. They preserve a world that vanished in 70 AD, suggesting they were written while that world still existed. This brings us to one of the most powerful arguments for early dating, an argument that modern scholars desperately want to suppress. It's the argument from eyewitness testimony and living memory. In the ancient world, just as today, people understood the difference between first-hand and second-hand accounts. They valued eyewitness testimony above hearsay. They knew that memory was most reliable when it was fresh, when it was frequently rehearsed, when it concerned events of deep personal significance. The early Christian community was built on eyewitness testimony. The apostles weren't just teachers or theologians. They were witnesses. They had seen Jesus alive after his crucifixion. They had touched his wounded hands, had eaten with him, had received his final instructions. Their authority didn't come from their scholarship or their eloquence. It came from their direct experience of the risen Christ. This emphasis on eyewitness testimony permeates the New Testament. Luke begins his gospel by explaining that he's compiled his account based on the testimony of those who were eyewitnesses from the beginning. John concludes his gospel by affirming that his testimony is true, because he's the disciple who saw these things and recorded them. Peter, in his letters, reminds his readers that the apostles weren't following cleverly devised myths, but were eyewitnesses of Christ's majesty. If the Gospels were written in the 90s AD, as modern scholars claim, most of these eyewitnesses would have been dead. The living link to the historical Jesus would have been broken. The early Christian community would have been relying on second- or third-hand accounts, on traditions that had been filtered through multiple generations of transmission. But if the Gospels were written in the 50s and 60s AD, as the evidence suggests, then the eyewitnesses were still alive, still active, still available to verify or correct the written accounts. The Gospel writers weren't working from faded memories or uncertain traditions. They had access to the people who were there when it happened. This makes all the difference in the world for historical reliability. A document written 20 years after an event by someone who was present is fundamentally different from a document written 70 years later by someone who heard about it from others. The first is primary source material. The second is, at best, secondary source material that has passed through multiple filters of transmission and interpretation. Modern scholarship has tried to solve this problem by developing elaborate theories about oral tradition and community preservation of Jesus' sayings. They argue that even if the Gospels were written late, the traditions behind them were carefully maintained by the early Christian communities. They point to studies of oral cultures that show remarkable accuracy in the transmission of important stories and teachings. But these theories, while ingenious, miss a crucial point. Even if oral tradition could preserve the basic content of Jesus' teachings, it couldn't preserve the specific details, the precise chronology, the exact geographical references, the subtle interpersonal dynamics that we find in the Gospel accounts. These kinds of details require either eyewitness knowledge or very early written sources that preserve eyewitness testimony. The Gospels aren't just collections of Jesus' sayings. They're sophisticated biographical narratives that weave together teaching, miracle accounts, geographical movements, character development, and theological reflection into coherent wholes. This kind of literary achievement suggests authors who had intimate knowledge of their subject matter, not compilers working from fragmentary oral traditions. Furthermore, the differences between the Gospels support early rather than late composition. If the Gospels were written decades after the events, we would expect them to show more uniformity as the tradition stabilized and standardized. Instead, we find diversity in emphasis, in selection of material, in theological perspective. This diversity suggests independent sources working from their own memories and concerns, not later editors harmonizing established traditions. Matthew emphasizes Jesus' fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy, reflecting a Jewish Christian perspective. Mark focuses on Jesus' actions and miracles, preserving what appears to be Peter's energetic preaching style. Luke provides careful chronological and geographical details, reflecting his role as a historian and companion of Paul. John offers profound theological reflection combined with intimate personal details that could only come from someone in Jesus' inner circle. This diversity within unity is exactly what we would expect from early eyewitness accounts. It's not what we would expect from late community productions or editorial harmonizations of established traditions. The resistance to early gospel dating isn't just academic stubbornness. It's ideological warfare disguised as scholarship. Because if the Gospels were written early, by eyewitnesses or their close associates, then they carry the weight of historical testimony. They can't be dismissed as legendary developments or theological reflections. They demand to be taken seriously as historical sources. And that changes everything. It means the miracle accounts can't be explained away as later legendary additions. It means Jesus' claims about his divine identity can't be dismissed as later Christian theology read back into the historical record. It means the resurrection accounts carry the weight of eyewitness testimony, not community wishful thinking. This is why the battle over gospel dating matters so much. It's not just about when some ancient documents were written. It's about the historical foundation of Christian faith. It's about whether the New Testament preserves reliable testimony about Jesus or whether it's a collection of pious legends that developed over decades of retelling. The evidence overwhelmingly supports early composition. The silence about Jerusalem's destruction, the abrupt ending of Acts, the consistent manuscript attributions, the testimony of the Church Fathers, the linguistic and cultural accuracy, the emphasis on eyewitness testimony, all of it points to the same conclusion. The Gospels were written while the witnesses were still alive, while the memories were still fresh, while the events they describe were still within living memory of thousands of people who could have corrected any inaccuracies. But acknowledging this evidence requires abandoning the naturalistic assumptions that underpin modern biblical criticism. It requires admitting that supernatural events might actually have occurred. It requires taking seriously the possibility that Jesus really was who he claimed to be. And that's a step that many scholars are simply unwilling to take, no matter what the evidence shows. The academic establishment has built an entire industry around these late dates, and careers have been made defending them. Tenure has been granted, books have been published, doctoral dissertations have been written, all based on the assumption that the Gospels are late documents. To admit they were wrong about something so fundamental would require a complete restructuring of New Testament studies. Think about what's at stake here. If a prominent scholar who has spent 30 years teaching that Mark was written in 70 AD suddenly acknowledged that the evidence points to composition in the 50s, what happens to their reputation? What happens to their published works? What happens to their students who have built their own careers on these foundations? The academic world doesn't reward admissions of error, especially not errors of this magnitude. It rewards consistency, even when that consistency flies in the face of mounting evidence. And so the late dating theory has become entrenched, not because it's true, but because too many people have too much invested in maintaining it. But here's what makes this conspiracy even more insidious. The scholars who promote late dating aren't just wrong about when the Gospels were written. They're actively suppressing evidence that contradicts their position. They've created a scholarly echo chamber where dissenting voices are marginalized, where early dating advocates are dismissed as fundamentalists or apologists, where the very possibility of supernatural revelation is ruled out before the investigation even begins. This is intellectual tyranny masquerading as academic freedom. It's the enforcement of orthodoxy through peer pressure and professional intimidation. Young scholars quickly learn that questioning the late dating consensus is career suicide. They learn to conform their research to acceptable conclusions, regardless of where the evidence might lead. Consider what happened when Colin Hemer published his groundbreaking study on the Book of Acts. Hemer was a classical scholar and archaeologist who spent years examining the historical details in Acts. His conclusion was devastating to the late dating theory. He demonstrated that Acts shows intimate knowledge of conditions that existed before 62 AD, but no knowledge of events that occurred after that date. Hemer cataloged over 80 specific details in Acts that can be verified through external sources. The political situations, the local customs, the geographical references, the social conditions, all perfectly match what we know about the Mediterranean world in the 50s and early 60s AD. But they don't match what we know about conditions after 70 AD. This is precisely what we would expect if Acts was written early, while these conditions still existed. It's not what we would expect if Acts was written in the 80s or 90s AD, when many of these details would have been forgotten or changed beyond recognition. Hemer's work should have revolutionized New Testament studies. It should have forced scholars to reconsider their assumptions about gospel dating. Instead, it was largely ignored or dismissed. The academic establishment had too much invested in maintaining their late dating consensus to acknowledge research that threatened their theoretical foundations. This pattern repeats itself again and again. Whenever evidence emerges that supports early dating, it's either ignored, explained away, or attacked on methodological grounds. The scholarly gatekeepers have created a system where only evidence that supports their predetermined conclusions is considered credible. But the evidence keeps mounting anyway. Archaeological discoveries continue to confirm the historical accuracy of the gospel accounts. Manuscript discoveries continue to push back the dates of our earliest New Testament texts. Linguistic analysis continues to support the authenticity of the gospel attributions. Each new piece of evidence strengthens the case for early composition, yet the academic consensus remains unmoved. This isn't how science is supposed to work. In genuine scientific inquiry, theories are modified or abandoned when the evidence no longer supports them. But in biblical studies, theories are protected regardless of contradictory evidence. The most recent challenge to late dating comes from an unexpected source: papyrology. Papyrologists study ancient manuscripts, and their work has consistently pushed gospel composition dates earlier than critical scholars are comfortable acknowledging. Consider P52, a small fragment of John's Gospel discovered in Egypt. This manuscript has been dated to around 125 AD, which means John's Gospel must have been written early enough to circulate to Egypt and be copied by that date. If John was really written in 95 AD, as critical scholars claim, that leaves very little time for circulation and copying. But P52 is just the beginning. P66, P75, and other early papyri all point to earlier composition dates than the critical consensus allows. These manuscripts preserve text forms that show the Gospels were already established and circulating widely by the early 2nd century. The papyrological evidence is particularly devastating to theories about anonymous Gospel circulation. These early manuscripts already contain the traditional Gospel titles. They're not anonymous documents that somehow acquired names over time. They're titled works from the very beginning of the manuscript tradition. Yet, critical scholars have found ways to explain away even this evidence. They argue that titles could have been added very early, that circulation patterns don't necessarily indicate composition dates, that manuscript evidence must be interpreted within larger theoretical frameworks. These explanations become increasingly strained as more evidence accumulates. At some point, the weight of evidence becomes so overwhelming that continued resistance begins to look less like careful scholarship and more like ideological stubbornness. The theological implications of early gospel dating go far beyond questions of historical reliability. They strike at the heart of how we understand the development of Christian doctrine. If the Gospels were written early by people who knew Jesus personally, then the high Christology we find in these documents isn't a later theological development. It's original eyewitness testimony about who Jesus claimed to be and how his earliest followers understood him. This is particularly significant for John's Gospel, which contains the most explicit statements about Jesus' divine identity. Critical scholars have long argued that John's high Christology represents a later theological development, that the historical Jesus didn't make the kinds of claims about himself that we find in the fourth Gospel. But if John was written by the beloved disciple in the 60s AD, as early dating suggests, then these claims go back to Jesus himself. They're not later theological reflections, but contemporary testimony from someone who heard Jesus make these claims directly. The implications extend to other doctrinal questions as well. The Trinity, the Incarnation, the Atonement, all of these central Christian doctrines are rooted in gospel testimony about Jesus. If the Gospels preserve early, reliable accounts of Jesus' words and actions, then these doctrines have apostolic authority. They're not later theological constructions, but revealed truths preserved by eyewitness testimony. This is why the dating question matters so much to Christian faith and practice. It's not just an academic exercise, it's a question about the foundation of everything Christians believe about Jesus. The resistance to early dating also reveals something disturbing about the state of biblical scholarship. It shows how deeply naturalistic assumptions have penetrated the field, how thoroughly supernatural possibilities have been excluded from consideration. When scholars automatically assume that accurate prophecy is impossible, they're not being objective investigators. They're bringing philosophical commitments to their research that predetermine their conclusions. They've decided in advance that certain kinds of evidence cannot be authentic, regardless of how strong that evidence might be. This isn't neutral scholarship. It's worldview-driven interpretation that masquerades as objective analysis. It's the imposition of materialistic philosophy on historical investigation. The tragedy is that this approach has infected not just secular universities, but also seminaries and Christian colleges. Students preparing for ministry are taught to be embarrassed by supernatural claims, to explain away miracles, to treat prophecy as historical hindsight rather than divine revelation. They graduate from seminary with their faith weakened rather than strengthened, more concerned with appearing scholarly than with defending biblical truth. They enter ministry already compromised, already infected with the skepticism that has destroyed confidence in biblical authority. This intellectual corruption has had devastating effects on the church. When pastors don't believe in the historical reliability of Scripture, why should their congregations? When seminary professors treat gospel accounts as theological reflections rather than historical testimony, what kind of ministers are they producing? The crisis of biblical authority that plagues modern Christianity can be traced directly back to the acceptance of late gospel dating and the naturalistic assumptions that support it. Churches that once stood firmly on the foundation of biblical truth now wobble uncertainly, trying to maintain relevance while undermining their own authority. But there's hope in this darkness. A new generation of scholars is beginning to challenge the established consensus. They're examining the evidence without the philosophical constraints that have limited their predecessors. They're asking fresh questions and reaching different conclusions. These scholars aren't fundamentalist reactionaries trying to defend outdated positions. They're serious academics using rigorous methodology to investigate the origins of the Gospels, and their research is consistently pointing toward earlier dates, apostolic authorship, and historical reliability. The work of scholars like Richard Bauckham, whose research on eyewitness testimony has revolutionized gospel studies, shows what becomes possible when investigators approach the evidence without naturalistic prejudices. Bauckham's careful analysis demonstrates that the Gospels preserve authentic eyewitness accounts, not later community traditions. Similarly, the archaeological work of scholars like Craig Evans has consistently confirmed the historical accuracy of Gospel accounts. Evans has shown that the Gospels reflect intimate knowledge of first-century Palestinian conditions that would have been difficult or impossible to reconstruct decades after the fact. The linguistic research of scholars like Maurice Casey has demonstrated that the Gospels preserve authentic Aramaic traditions that can be traced back to Jesus himself. Casey's work shows that the Greek Gospels often preserve evidence of underlying Aramaic originals, suggesting very early composition or translation. Each of these scholars approached the evidence from different angles, using different methodologies, yet they all reached similar conclusions. The Gospels are early, reliable, and historically trustworthy. They preserve authentic testimony about Jesus that goes back to the people who knew him personally. This convergence of evidence from multiple independent lines of research should be compelling to anyone genuinely interested in historical truth. Yet the academic establishment continues to resist these findings, continues to defend positions that become less tenable with each passing year. The resistance reveals something profound about human nature and institutional inertia. Once people have invested their careers and reputations in particular positions, they become extraordinarily reluctant to acknowledge error, even when the evidence becomes overwhelming. Pride, professional interest, and ideological commitment combine to create almost impenetrable resistance to change. But truth has a way of surfacing despite institutional resistance. The evidence for early gospel dating continues to accumulate, continues to strengthen, continues to challenge the assumptions that have dominated biblical studies for over a century. Young scholars who haven't yet invested their careers in defending the old consensus are beginning to ask different questions and reach different conclusions. They're approaching the evidence with fresh eyes, without the theoretical baggage that has constrained their predecessors. This generational change, combined with mounting archaeological and manuscript evidence, suggests that a paradigm shift in gospel studies may be inevitable. The question isn't whether the late dating consensus will eventually collapse, but when and how completely. When that shift occurs, it will have profound implications not just for biblical scholarship, but for Christian faith and practice. It will restore confidence in biblical authority that has been eroded by decades of skeptical scholarship. It will demonstrate that faith and scholarship can work together rather than in opposition. It will show that the gospel accounts deserve to be taken seriously as historical testimony, not dismissed as legendary development. The truth about gospel dating has been suppressed for too long. The evidence has been ignored, explained away, or marginalized by scholars more concerned with maintaining theoretical consistency than with following evidence wherever it leads. But suppression of truth is ultimately self-defeating. Evidence has a way of accumulating until it becomes impossible to ignore. We're approaching that tipping point now. The case for early gospel composition has become so strong that continued resistance is beginning to look less like careful scholarship and more like willful blindness. The conspiracy of silence is beginning to crack, and the truth is starting to emerge. This isn't just about dating ancient documents. It's about the reliability of our sources for the most important events in human history. It's about whether we can trust the gospel accounts of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. It's about the foundation of Christian faith itself. The scholars who have promoted late dating and questioned gospel reliability have done immense damage to Christian confidence and biblical authority. They've created unnecessary doubt about the historical foundations of faith. They've weakened the church by undermining trust in Scripture, but their influence is waning. The evidence is too strong, the accumulation of data too overwhelming, the logical problems with late dating too obvious. Truth is more powerful than academic consensus, and truth is finally beginning to prevail. The Gospels are early, reliable, and historically trustworthy. They were written by people who knew Jesus personally or had direct access to those who did. They preserve authentic eyewitness testimony about the most important life ever lived. They deserve our confidence, our study, and our faith. This isn't just about proving early dating through evidence, though that evidence is overwhelming. This is about understanding why the truth was hidden from you in the first place. Because when you dig deeper into the motivations behind late dating theory, you uncover a deliberate strategy to undermine the supernatural claims of Christianity. The strategy is brilliant in its simplicity. If you can convince people that the Gospels were written decades after Jesus died, You create automatic skepticism about everything they contain. Miracles become suspect because they had time to develop into legends. Jesus' claims about his divine identity become questionable because later theologians could have invented them. The resurrection accounts lose their power because eyewitnesses weren't around to verify them. This isn't accidental. It's the logical outcome of a worldview that cannot accept supernatural intervention in human history. When your starting assumption is that miracles don't happen, then any document that records miracles must be explained away. Late dating provides the perfect explanation. It gives naturalistic scholars the time they need to transform divine revelation into human legend. But here's what makes this deception even more insidious. The late dating theory doesn't just attack the Gospels directly, it attacks them by attacking the very concept of eyewitness testimony itself. Modern critics have developed elaborate theories about how oral tradition works, how communities shape memories, how stories evolve over time. They've made eyewitness testimony seem unreliable, uncertain, prone to legendary development. These theories sound sophisticated and scientific. They're filled with technical jargon about form criticism, redaction criticism, and community theology. They reference studies in anthropology, psychology, and folklore. They create an impression of scholarly rigor that masks their fundamental assumption. Human testimony about divine events cannot be trusted. This assault on eyewitness testimony strikes at the heart of biblical authority, because the entire New Testament is built on the foundation of eyewitness accounts. The apostles weren't theologians or philosophers. They were witnesses. Their authority came from their direct experience of Jesus, particularly their experience of seeing him alive after his crucifixion. When Paul lists the resurrection appearances in 1 Corinthians 15, he's not appealing to theological arguments or philosophical proofs. He's citing witnesses. More than 500 people saw the risen Christ at one time, he says, most of whom are still alive. He's essentially saying, if you don't believe me, go ask them yourself. They were there. They saw it happen. This emphasis on eyewitness testimony wasn't unique to Paul. It permeates the entire New Testament. John writes that what we have heard, what we have seen with our eyes, what we have looked at and touched with our hands concerning the word of life, this we proclaim to you. Luke explains that he carefully investigated everything from the beginning, interviewing eyewitnesses and ministers of the word. Peter declares that we did not follow cleverly devised stories when we told you about the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ in power, but we were eyewitnesses of his majesty. The early church understood that their credibility depended on their connection to people who were actually there. When they needed to replace Judas among the 12 apostles, what was their criterion? The replacement had to be someone who had been with Jesus from the beginning, from his baptism to his ascension. Why? Because apostolic authority was rooted in eyewitness experience. This creates a massive problem for late dating theorists. If the Gospels were written in the 80s and 90s AD, most of the original eyewitnesses would have been dead. The living link to the historical Jesus would have been broken. The early Christian communities would have been forced to rely on second-hand accounts, fading memories, and evolving traditions. But that's not what the evidence shows. The evidence shows a community that valued eyewitness testimony, that appealed to living witnesses, that based its authority on direct connection to the events they proclaimed. This kind of community wouldn't have waited decades to write down the most important story in human history. The linguistic evidence supports this conclusion powerfully. The Gospels are written in Greek, but they preserve dozens of Aramaic words and expressions. They record Jesus' actual Aramaic words in several places. Talitha koum, Ephphatha, Eloi Eloi lema sabachthani. These aren't translations or later additions. They're direct quotations preserved in the original language. More significantly, scholars have identified numerous Aramaisms throughout the Greek text of the Gospels. These are Hebrew and Aramaic expressions that have been translated literally into Greek, creating awkward constructions that make sense in Aramaic but sound strange in Greek. The presence of so many Aramaisms suggests composition by people who were thinking in Aramaic while writing in Greek, people who were native speakers of Jesus' own language. As Christianity spread into the Greek-speaking world and became increasingly Gentile, these Aramaic influences would naturally have faded. The fact that the Gospels preserve so many of them suggests they were written while the Aramaic-speaking witnesses were still active and influential in the early Christian community. The geographical evidence tells the same story. The Gospels display intimate knowledge of Palestinian geography as it existed before 70 AD. They know about places, roads, and landmarks that were destroyed or abandoned after the Jewish War. They understand the political and social dynamics of first-century Palestine in ways that would have been difficult to reconstruct from a distance of decades. Recent archaeological discoveries have confirmed detail after detail from the Gospel accounts. The Pool of Bethesda with its 5 porticos, exactly as John describes it. The Pool of Siloam, where Jesus sent the blind man to wash. The stone pavement called Gabbatha, where Pilate judged Jesus. The tomb of Caiaphas the high priest. Even the ossuary of James, the brother of Jesus. Each discovery strengthens the case for eyewitness composition. These aren't the kinds of details that would survive in oral tradition for decades. They're the specific, concrete observations of people who were actually there, who walked these streets, who knew this landscape intimately. But perhaps the most compelling evidence comes from what the Gospels don't say. They don't reflect the theological controversies that dominated the church after 70 AD. They don't address the crisis of faith that the temple's destruction created. They don't explain how Christianity survived the end of the sacrificial system. They don't show awareness of the complete separation between Christianity and Judaism that occurred after the Jewish War. This silence is deafening. If the Gospels were written after 70 AD, they would necessarily reflect the new reality that the church faced. They would address the questions that tormented believers. How could God allow his temple to be destroyed? What happened to his promises to Israel? How should Christians relate to Judaism now that the center of Jewish worship was gone? Instead, the Gospels preserve a world that vanished in 70 AD. They record Jesus teaching in the temple courts, debating with Pharisees and Sadducees, operating within the intact world of first-century Judaism. They preserve a snapshot of a world that was about to disappear forever. This preservation suggests composition before the catastrophe, while that world still existed, while the memories were still fresh, while the witnesses were still alive to verify the accuracy of the accounts. The manuscript evidence adds another layer of confirmation. Our earliest Gospel manuscripts already contain the traditional authorship attributions. Papyrus 66, dated to around 200 AD, is titled Gospel According to John. Papyrus 75, from around the same period, contains titles for both Luke and John. These aren't later additions. They're original parts of the manuscript tradition. The universality of these attributions is remarkable. Every single manuscript of the Gospels, in every language, in every geographical location, attributes them to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. There are no anonymous copies anywhere. There are no manuscripts that attribute the Gospels to different authors. The attribution is universal and consistent across the entire manuscript tradition. If the Gospels were really anonymous for decades before receiving their traditional titles, this consistency would be impossible to explain. How would scribes working independently in different parts of the Roman Empire all agree on the same attributions? How would the names Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John become universally associated with specific texts if there was no original connection? The only logical explanation is that the attributions weren't added later. They were original. The Gospels were never anonymous because they were written by the people whose names they bear. But the manuscript evidence reveals something even more significant. The early manuscripts show that the Gospels were circulating widely by the early 2nd century. This means they must have been composed and copied and distributed well before that time. The logistics of ancient publishing make late dating increasingly implausible. Consider what would have been required for a Gospel written in 95 AD to appear in manuscript copies throughout the Mediterranean world by 125 AD. The original would have to be copied multiple times. These copies would have to be transported to major cities like Alexandria, Antioch, and Rome. Local scribes would have to make additional copies. The entire process would take decades, not years. The fact that we have early manuscripts from multiple geographical locations suggests that the Gospels were composed much earlier than critical scholars admit. They needed time not just to be written, but to be copied, distributed, and established as authoritative texts throughout the Christian world. The early Church Fathers provide crucial testimony that confirms this timeline. Ignatius of Antioch, writing around 110 AD, clearly knows and quotes from multiple Gospels. Polycarp, around 120 AD, shows familiarity with Gospel material. The Didac, possibly dating to the 1st century, contains numerous Gospel quotations. These early Christian writers don't treat the Gospels as recent publications. They cite them as established authorities, as texts that have already achieved widespread acceptance and recognition. This suggests a much longer period of circulation than late dating allows. Justin Martyr, writing around 150 AD, provides particularly important testimony. He refers to the memoirs of the apostles and quotes extensively from all 4 Gospels. His quotations show that the Gospel texts were already fixed and standardized by his time. This stability suggests decades of prior circulation and copying. Most significantly, Justin connects the Gospels directly to apostolic authorship. He's not relying on anonymous community traditions or theological reflections. He's appealing to the testimony of people who were actually there, who saw what happened, who heard what Jesus said. The chain of testimony from the apostolic age to Justin's time is remarkably short and well documented. Justin was taught by Christian teachers who could trace their instruction back to the apostles themselves. This isn't a game of telephone played over centuries. It's direct transmission across 1 or 2 generations at most. When Justin affirms that the Gospels were written by apostles and their associates, he's not repeating distant legends. He's passing on information that came from people who knew the authors personally. His testimony carries enormous historical weight, yet modern scholars dismiss it as unreliable tradition. This dismissal reveals the depth of bias that infects contemporary gospel criticism. When ancient testimony supports early dating and apostolic authorship, it's rejected as legendary. When it can be interpreted to support late dating, it's accepted as historically valuable. This isn't objective scholarship. It's selective use of evidence to support predetermined conclusions. The pattern repeats itself throughout the field. Archaeological discoveries that confirm gospel accuracy are ignored or minimized. Manuscript evidence that points to early composition is explained away. Linguistic analysis that supports authenticity is dismissed as inconclusive. Meanwhile, theoretical constructs like the hypothetical Q source are treated as established facts, even though no manuscript of Q has ever been discovered. Complex theories about community development and theological evolution are accepted without question, even though they're based on speculation rather than evidence. This double standard reveals the ideological nature of much contemporary scholarship. Evidence that supports traditional positions must meet impossibly high standards of proof. Evidence that supports critical theories is accepted on minimal grounds. The deck is stacked against any conclusion that might support the historical reliability of the Gospels. But truth has a way of emerging despite academic prejudice. The evidence for early Gospel composition continues to accumulate from multiple independent sources. Archaeological discoveries, manuscript finds, linguistic analysis, and historical investigation all point in the same direction. The convergence is becoming impossible to ignore. When evidence from completely different fields of study all supports the same conclusion, that conclusion deserves serious consideration regardless of how it fits with established academic opinion. The implications extend far beyond technical questions about gospel dating. They strike at fundamental issues about the nature of historical knowledge and the possibility of divine revelation. If the Gospels are early, reliable, eyewitness accounts, then the supernatural events they record cannot be dismissed as later legendary developments. The miracles, the resurrection, the claims about Jesus' divine identity, all of these become historical questions rather than theological speculations. They must be evaluated on their historical merits rather than dismissed on philosophical grounds. This shift in perspective terrifies scholars who have built their careers on naturalistic assumptions. It threatens to overturn decades of assured results of critical scholarship. It challenges the entire framework that has dominated biblical studies since the Enlightenment. But perhaps that framework needs to be challenged. Perhaps it's time to admit that the naturalistic assumptions that have guided biblical criticism are philosophical choices rather than scientific necessities. Perhaps it's time to consider the possibility that the gospel writers were telling the truth about what they saw and experienced. The resistance to this possibility reveals something profound about human nature. People can become so invested in their worldview that they refuse to consider evidence that challenges it. They'd rather maintain their philosophical consistency than follow the evidence wherever it leads. This is particularly tragic in biblical studies because the stakes are so high. We're not just talking about ancient history. We're talking about the foundation of Christian faith. We're talking about the reliability of the sources that tell us about the most important life ever lived. When scholars undermine confidence in the gospel accounts, they're not just engaging in academic debate. They're affecting the faith of millions of people who look to the Bible for truth about God, about salvation, about the meaning and purpose of human existence. The damage done by critical scholarship over the past century is incalculable. Churches that once stood firmly on biblical authority now wobble uncertainly. Pastors who once preached with confidence now hedge their proclamations with scholarly qualifications. Believers who once trusted in the reliability of Scripture now doubt whether they can know anything for certain about Jesus. This crisis of confidence hasn't emerged in a vacuum. It's the direct result of accepting theories that were designed to undermine biblical authority. It's the inevitable consequence of allowing naturalistic assumptions to drive biblical interpretation. But the crisis also creates an opportunity. When the old assumptions are finally abandoned, when the evidence is finally examined objectively, when the truth about gospel dating is finally acknowledged, it will restore confidence in biblical reliability that has been eroded for generations. The Gospels are not late theological reflections written by unknown authors decades after the events they describe. They are early, reliable, eyewitness accounts written by people who knew Jesus personally or had direct access to those who did. This conclusion isn't based on wishful thinking or religious prejudice. It's based on evidence from multiple independent sources that all point in the same direction. The burden of proof has shifted. Those who want to maintain late dating must explain away an increasingly massive body of evidence that contradicts their position. The truth about gospel origins has been hidden long enough. The conspiracy of silence that has suppressed this evidence is beginning to crumble. A new generation of scholars is asking different questions and reaching different conclusions. The revolution in gospel studies may not happen overnight, but it's coming. The evidence is too strong. The logical problems with late dating too obvious, the implications too significant to ignore indefinitely. When that revolution occurs, it will vindicate the faith of generations of Christians who trusted in the reliability of the gospel accounts, despite scholarly skepticism. It will demonstrate that faith and scholarship can work together rather than in opposition. It will show that the Bible deserves our confidence, our study, and our commitment. The Gospels tell the truth about Jesus. They preserve authentic testimony from people who were there, who saw what happened, who heard what he said. They deserve to be taken seriously as historical sources, not dismissed as legendary developments. This is the truth that has been hidden from you. This is the secret that biblical scholars don't want you to discover. The Gospels are early, reliable, and historically trustworthy. They provide a solid foundation for Christian faith that no amount of critical skepticism can shake. The question now is what you'll do with this knowledge. Will you continue to accept the theories that have undermined biblical authority? Or will you examine the evidence for yourself and reach your own conclusions? The truth is available to anyone willing to investigate it honestly. The evidence is overwhelming for those with eyes to see it. The time has come to reject the deceptions that have masqueraded as scholarship and embrace the reliability of the gospel accounts. Your faith doesn't have to rest on shifting sand. It can stand on the solid rock of eyewitness testimony preserved in documents written while the witnesses were still alive. The Gospels tell the truth about Jesus, and that truth can transform your understanding of who he was and what he accomplished. The conspiracy to hide this truth is finally being exposed. The evidence for early gospel composition is becoming impossible to suppress. The reliability of the New Testament is being vindicated by scholarship that follows the evidence, rather than defending predetermined conclusions. This is just the beginning of what promises to be a complete transformation in how we understand the origins of Christianity. The implications will ripple through every area of biblical studies, theology, and Christian practice. But for now, it's enough to know this. The Gospels are not late documents written by unknown authors based on fading memories and evolving traditions. They are early, reliable, eyewitness accounts that preserve authentic testimony about the most important events in human history. That truth has been hidden from you for too long. It's time to reclaim it, to study it, to build your faith upon it. The Gospels tell the truth about Jesus, and that truth will set you free from the doubts and uncertainties that critical scholarship has created. The secret is out. The conspiracy is exposed. The truth about gospel dating can no longer be suppressed. And that changes everything about how we understand the reliability and authority of the New Testament. Testament. But what does all this mean for you personally? What does it mean for your faith, your understanding of Christianity, and your relationship with the Jesus described in these pages? When you understand that the Gospels were written by eyewitnesses, while other eyewitnesses were still alive to verify their accounts, everything changes. These aren't distant religious documents compiled by anonymous editors generations after the fact. These are immediate, personal testimonies from people who walked with Jesus, who heard his voice, who watched him heal the sick and raise the dead. Think about what this means for the miracle accounts. When Matthew records Jesus feeding 5,000 people with a few loaves and fish, he's not repeating a legend that developed over decades of retelling. He's recording an event he personally witnessed. When Mark describes Jesus calming a storm with a word, he's preserving Peter's first-hand account of something that terrified and amazed the disciples who were actually in that boat. The implications are staggering. Every healing, every teaching, every interaction with religious leaders, every prediction about the future, all of it carries the weight of eyewitness testimony. These weren't stories that grew in the telling. They were carefully preserved memories of people who knew their testimony would be scrutinized by thousands of other witnesses. Consider the resurrection accounts. Critics have long argued that the resurrection stories developed gradually, that early Christians slowly transformed their grief and disappointment into hope and victory through mythological thinking. But if the Gospels were written while the witnesses were still alive, this theory collapses completely. Paul's letters, which even critical scholars acknowledge were written early, already contain detailed accounts of resurrection appearances. In 1 Corinthians, written in the mid-50s AD, Paul lists specific witnesses by name and mentions that most of them are still living. He's essentially challenging anyone who doubts the resurrection to go interview the witnesses themselves. This is not how legends develop. Legends require time, distance, and the absence of contradictory witnesses. But the resurrection accounts emerged immediately, in the presence of thousands of people who could have easily refuted them if they were false. The fact that Christianity spread rapidly through Jerusalem, the very city where Jesus was crucified, proves that his enemies couldn't produce his body or find witnesses to contradict the apostolic testimony. When you combine Paul's early letters with the gospel accounts written by eyewitnesses in the 50s and 60s AD, you have multiple independent testimonies to the same events, recorded while hostile witnesses were still available to challenge them. This is exactly the kind of evidence that historians value most highly. But the personal implications go even deeper. If Jesus really did rise from the dead, if eyewitnesses really did see him alive after his crucifixion, if these accounts really are reliable historical testimony rather than legendary development, then Jesus' claims about himself demand your personal response. He claimed to be the way, the truth, and the life. He claimed that no one comes to the Father except through him. He claimed to have authority to forgive sins, to judge the living and the dead, to grant eternal life. These weren't claims that developed gradually through theological reflection. According to eyewitness testimony recorded while other eyewitnesses could verify it, these were claims Jesus made about himself during his earthly ministry. The early dating of the Gospels eliminates the escape route that many people use to avoid dealing with Jesus' claims. You can't dismiss them as later Christian theology imposed on a simple Jewish teacher. You can't explain them away as legendary development over time. You have to deal with them as historical claims made by a historical person and witnessed by people who recorded their testimony while others could challenge it. This brings us face to face with what C.S. Lewis called the trilemma. Jesus was either a liar who deliberately deceived people about his identity, a lunatic who sincerely but mistakenly believed he was God, or he was exactly who he claimed to be, the Lord of all creation. The one option you don't have, based on the eyewitness testimony preserved in the early Gospels, is to dismiss him as simply a good moral teacher who never claimed to be divine. Good moral teachers don't claim to be God. They don't claim to have existed before Abraham. They don't claim that seeing them is equivalent to seeing the Father. They don't accept worship from their followers. They don't promise to return in glory to judge the world. The Jesus described in the eyewitness accounts did all of these things. And the witnesses who recorded these claims weren't writing decades later based on faded memories or evolved traditions. They were writing while other people who heard these claims were still alive, still available to confirm or deny what Jesus actually said. This is why the academic establishment has fought so hard to maintain late dating theories. It's not really about manuscript evidence or archaeological discoveries. It's about avoiding the implications of early, reliable, eyewitness testimony about Jesus' divine claims. If the Gospels are late documents written by unknown authors based on evolved traditions, then Jesus' claims can be explained away as later Christian theology. But if the Gospels are early documents written by eyewitnesses while other eyewitnesses could verify them, then Jesus' claims must be taken seriously as historical facts. And if Jesus really made these claims about himself, if he really did the miracles recorded in eyewitness accounts, if he really did rise from the dead as multiple independent witnesses testified, then he demands your personal allegiance. You can't remain neutral about someone who claims to be the judge of your eternal destiny. The conspiracy to hide the truth about gospel dating isn't just about protecting academic theories. It's about protecting people from having to deal with the implications of reliable testimony about Jesus. It's about maintaining the illusion that you can treat Jesus as an inspiring teacher while ignoring his claims to divine authority. But the evidence won't allow you that comfort anymore. The Gospels preserve early, reliable, eyewitness testimony about a man who claimed to be God in human flesh, who demonstrated that claim through miraculous works, and who proved it conclusively by rising from the dead. This testimony was recorded while hostile witnesses were still available to challenge it. Yet it went unchallenged and formed the foundation of a movement that transformed the world. The truth is out. The evidence is overwhelming. The conspiracy is crumbling. After decades of suppression, the authentic dates of gospel composition can no longer be hidden. The Gospels are early, reliable, eyewitness accounts that preserve the testimony of people who walked with Jesus, while others who knew him could verify every word. Your faith doesn't have to rest on the shifting sand of critical skepticism. It can stand on the solid rock of historical truth. The question now is simple. Will you continue believing the lies that have masqueraded as scholarship? Or will you embrace the evidence that vindicates everything Christianity has always claimed? The choice is yours, but the truth is undeniable.